It is 4:47 in the morning on May 5th, 1945. Private First Class Desmond Doss is alone on top of a 400-foot cliff on the island of Okinawa. Around him, the ground is torn apart by mortar craters and littered with the bodies of American soldiers. 50 yards away, Japanese machine guns are firing into the darkness. Doss has no rifle, no pistol, no grenades. He has a rope, a medic bag, and a prayer. He drags another wounded soldier to the edge of the cliff, loops the rope under the man's arms, and begins lowering him down the sheer rock face. The man disappears into the darkness below. Doss pulls the rope back up and whispers the same prayer he has whispered 74 times already tonight. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." Then he crawls back toward the sound of screaming. 12 hours earlier, every American soldier on this ridge retreated down the cliff when the Japanese counterattack began. Every soldier except Desmond Doss. He stayed behind because he made a promise 6 years ago that changed his life, nearly destroyed his military career, and turned him into the most unlikely hero of the Second World War. This is the story of the man who went to war without a weapon, saved more lives in one night than most soldiers save in a lifetime, and proved that courage has nothing to do with killing. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, a small city in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. His father, Tom Doss, was a carpenter who worked odd jobs to support his family. Tom was also a veteran of the First World War. He had served in France with the American Expeditionary Forces and came home with shrapnel still embedded in his legs and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer and never talked about. Tom Doss did not speak much about the war, but his son Desmond could see what it had done to him. Tom drank heavily. He had nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, and Desmond's mother, Bertha, would hold him until he calmed down. Desmond learned early that war leaves scars you cannot see, and that some wounds never heal. Bertha Doss was a devout Seventh-day Adventist, and she raised her children, Desmond and his older brother Harold, in the church. The Adventist faith shaped every part of their lives. They observed the Sabbath on Saturday, which meant no work and no secular activities from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. They did not eat meat. They believed in the 10 Commandments as absolute law, and the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was not negotiable. Bertha taught her sons that all human life was sacred and that taking a life for any reason was a sin against God. Desmond absorbed these lessons, and they became the foundation of his identity. When Desmond was 7 years old, he got into a fist fight with his brother Harold in their backyard. The fight started over something small, a toy or a game, but it escalated quickly. Desmond was smaller than Harold, but he was fierce. He grabbed a brick from a pile near the house and swung it at his brother's head. The brick connected with a sickening crack, and Harold collapsed. Blood poured from the wound. Desmond stood over him, frozen, the brick still in his hand. He thought he had killed his brother. Bertha heard the screams and ran outside. She scooped Harold into her arms and rushed him to the hospital. Desmond sat alone in the house, terrified, convinced he was going to prison or worse. Harold survived. The doctors stitched him up and sent him home with a bandage around his head. But the incident stayed with Desmond for the rest of his life. A few days later, Bertha took Desmond into the living room and pointed to a framed poster hanging on the wall. The Doss family was too poor to afford much decoration, but Bertha had bought this poster at a church sale, and it was one of the few things she considered valuable. The poster showed the 10 Commandments, with a small illustration for each one. The 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was illustrated with a scene from the Bible. Cain standing over the body of his brother Abel, a club in his hand, while God looked down in judgment. Bertha pointed to the image and said, "If you had killed your brother, you would have broken God's law. You would have committed murder." Desmond stared at the poster. He saw himself in Cain. He saw the brick in his hand. He saw Harold's blood. From that moment on, Desmond believed that taking a human life for any reason was the worst sin a person could commit. He promised himself and God that he would never kill another human being. Desmond grew up poor, but he was resourceful. He dropped out of high school after his sophomore year to help support his family. He worked as a joiner at a lumber company, learning carpentry from his father. Later, he got a job at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia, where he helped build hulls for naval vessels. The work was hard, but it paid well, and Desmond was good at it. His job at the shipyard also gave him a deferment from the military draft, which meant he would not be required to serve if the United States entered the war that was already consuming Europe and Asia. Desmond could have stayed at the shipyard for the entire war. He could have avoided combat entirely, but that is not what he did. On December 7, 1941, Desmond was at home in Lynchburg listening to the radio. The broadcast was interrupted by a news bulletin. Japanese aircraft had attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. 18 ships had been sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Japan. Congress approved it within hours. A few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and America was fully committed to the Second World War. Desmond listened to the reports and thought about what his mother had taught him. He thought about the poster on the wall, and he made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He was going to enlist. Desmond told his family that he wanted to serve his country, but he would not kill anyone. He would enlist as a medic. A medic's job was to save lives, not take them. His father was furious. Tom Doss had seen what war does to men, and he did not want his son anywhere near a battlefield. He told Desmond he was a fool. He told him the Army would chew him up and spit him out. Desmond's fiancée, Dorothy Schutte, a young woman he had met at church, also begged him not to go. She told him he could serve his country by building ships. Desmond listened to them, but he did not change his mind. He believed that if his country was going to war, he had a duty to help. He would not carry a rifle, but he would carry wounded men. He would not take lives, but he would save them. In April 1942, Desmond walked into a recruiting station and joined the United States Army. He requested assignment as a medic, and he made it clear from the start that his religious beliefs as a Seventh-day Adventist would prevent him from carrying a weapon or working on the Sabbath. The recruiter wrote it down, filed the paperwork, and sent Desmond to basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. No one told Desmond that refusing to carry a rifle would make him the most hated man in his unit. Basic training at Fort Jackson was supposed to last 13 weeks. For Desmond, it felt like 13 months. He arrived in the summer of 1942 and was assigned to Company B, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. The division was nicknamed the Statue of Liberty Division because most of its soldiers were from New York City, and the unit's insignia was the Statue of Liberty. Desmond was one of the few Southerners in the company, and his accent made him stand out. But it was not his accent that made him a target. It was his refusal to touch a rifle. From the first day, his drill sergeant, a man named Howell, saw Desmond as a problem. Sergeant Howell was a career soldier who believed that every man in a rifle company should be able to fight. A medic who refused to carry a weapon was, in Howell's view, worse than useless. He was a liability. Howell made it his mission to break Desmond or force him out of the Army. The other soldiers in the barracks followed Howell's lead. They called Desmond a conscientious objector, which was technically true, but they said it like it was an insult. They said he was hiding behind religion to avoid fighting. They said he thought he was better than them. They said he would get other men killed because he would not be able to defend himself or anyone else. Desmond tried to explain his beliefs. He told them he was not afraid to fight. He was not trying to avoid danger. He simply believed that killing was wrong, and he could not do it, even in war. No one wanted to listen. The harassment started small. Soldiers refused to speak to him. They excluded him from conversations and meals. They hid his equipment and stole his boots. Then it escalated. One night, a group of soldiers dragged Desmond out of his bunk and beat him. They hit him in the stomach and the face, careful not to leave marks that would be visible to officers. They told him he needed to quit, or they would make his life hell. Desmond did not fight back. He believed that violence, even in self-defense, was wrong. After they left, he got back into his bunk, prayed, and went to sleep. The next morning, he reported for duty as if nothing had happened. Sergeant Howell assigned Desmond the worst duties in the company. He made him clean latrines. He made him peel potatoes for hours in the mess hall. He made him run extra laps and do extra push-ups. Desmond endured it all without complaint. He prayed every night and read his Bible, and he refused to quit. His company commander, Captain Jack Glover, was just as hostile as Sergeant Howell. Glover believed that a medic who refused to carry a weapon was a disgrace to the uniform. He tried everything to get rid of Desmond. He ordered him to undergo psychiatric evaluations. The psychiatrists found nothing wrong with him. Glover recommended him for a Section 8 discharge, which was a military discharge for mental unfitness. Desmond refused to accept it. He told Captain Glover, "I want to serve my country. I just cannot kill." Glover responded, "Then you are unfit to serve in my company." In October 1942, Desmond's situation reached a breaking point. Every soldier in basic training was required to qualify on the rifle range before graduating. Qualification meant firing a certain number of rounds at targets and achieving a minimum score. It was a basic requirement, and no one had ever been allowed to skip it. Captain Glover ordered Desmond to report to the rifle range with the rest of the company. Desmond reported, but when he was handed a rifle, he refused to take it. Glover ordered him again. Desmond refused again. Glover had him arrested on the spot and charged with refusing a direct order. Desmond was placed in the stockade, a military jail, and told he would face a court-martial. If convicted, he could be sentenced to years in a military prison. He could be dishonorably discharged, which would follow him for the rest of his life. Desmond sat in his cell and prepared to defend himself. He believed he was right, and he was willing to accept the consequences. Dorothy Schutte came to visit him in the stockade. She had taken a bus from Virginia, and when she saw Desmond in his cell, she broke down, crying. She begged him to quit. She told him it was not worth it. She told him they could get married, and he could go back to the shipyard, and they could have a normal life. Desmond held her hand through the bars and told her, "If I do not stay true to what I believe, I do not deserve you." Dorothy left in tears. The court-martial was scheduled for the following week. Desmond sat in his cell and prayed. But the day before the trial, something unexpected happened. Tom Doss, Desmond's father, showed up at Fort Jackson. He was wearing his old Army uniform from the First World War, with his ribbons and his Purple Heart pinned to his chest. He had not worn the uniform in more than 20 years, but he put it on because he knew it would get him through the gate. Tom walked into the office of the base commander and demanded to see whoever was in charge of his son's case. He brought with him a letter from his former commanding officer, a man named Ewan L. James, who was now a congressman. The letter stated that under the Constitution of the United States, Desmond Doss had the right to serve as a non-combatant based on his sincerely held religious beliefs. The letter cited legal precedent and warned that a court-martial could result in a lawsuit against the Army and negative publicity. Tom Doss handed the letter to the base commander and said, "My son wants to serve. He is not a coward. You will not destroy him for believing in God." The charges against Desmond were dropped that afternoon. Captain Glover had no choice but to allow him to continue training as a medic without a rifle. Desmond graduated from basic training in early 1943. The soldiers in his unit still hated him. They still called him a coward. But Desmond did not care. He had kept his promise to God, and now he was going to war. The 77th Infantry Division deployed to the Pacific Theater in March 1944. Desmond's first taste of combat came during the Battle of Guam in July 1944. Guam was a U.S. territory that had been captured by the Japanese in 1941, and the Americans were determined to take it back. The 77th Division landed on the beaches on July 21st, and the fighting was immediate and brutal. Japanese machine guns fired from hidden positions in the jungle. Mortars rained down on the beaches. Within hours, dozens of American soldiers were dead or wounded, and the medics were overwhelmed. Desmond ran into the chaos without hesitation. He had no rifle, no helmet at first, just his medic bag. He crawled through machine gun fire to reach wounded soldiers. He treated sucking chest wounds by sealing them with petroleum jelly and gauze. He tourniqueted severed limbs. He injected morphine into men who were screaming in agony. He carried men on his back through the mud and the blood, dragging them to aid stations where doctors could operate. He worked for 18 hours straight without rest, and he saved dozens of lives. The soldiers who had called Desmond a coward in training began to change their minds. One soldier, a man named Glenn, had been shot in the leg and was lying in the open, bleeding out, while Japanese snipers fired at anyone who moved. Desmond crawled 50 yards under fire, reached Glenn, bandaged his leg, and dragged him to safety. Glenn survived, and later he found Desmond and shook his hand and said, "I am sorry for what I said about you. You are the bravest man I ever saw." Other soldiers had similar experiences. They saw Desmond run into fire that the rest of them would not even look at. They saw him treat wounded men while bullets were hitting the ground around him. They saw him pray over dying men and hold their hands and tell them they were going to be okay, even when he knew they were not. Desmond never carried a weapon, but he never hesitated. His reputation grew. Soldiers who had once wanted him gone now wanted him nearby. They knew that if they were hit, Doss would come for them no matter what. After Guam, the 77th fought in the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines. The fighting on Leyte was even worse than Guam. The Japanese defenders were dug into caves and bunkers in the jungle, and they fought to the death. American casualties were staggering. Desmond worked day and night, treating wounded men, carrying them through the mud, dodging sniper fire and artillery. He contracted dengue fever and lost 20 pounds, but he refused to be evacuated. He stayed with his unit because he knew they needed him. At one point, a Japanese grenade landed near a group of American soldiers. Desmond threw himself on top of the grenade to shield the others. The grenade was a dud. It did not explode. Desmond later said it was a miracle. The other soldiers said it was proof that God was protecting him. By the time the battle for Leyte ended, Desmond had saved more than 100 men. He was recommended for the Bronze Star. But the greatest test of his courage was still ahead. On April 1st, 1945, the 77th Infantry Division landed on the island of Okinawa as part of the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. More than 180,000 American troops and 1,500 ships took part in the operation. Okinawa was the last major island before the Japanese home islands, and both sides knew it. The Japanese defenders, more than 100,000 soldiers, were dug into caves, tunnels, and fortified positions across the island. They had orders to fight to the death and kill as many Americans as possible. The Americans expected heavy casualties. They were right. One of the most heavily defended positions on Okinawa was a plateau on the western side of the island called the Maida Escarpment. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress. The escarpment was a 400-foot vertical cliff made of jagged coral and rock. At the top was a flat open area, and beyond that, Japanese fortifications hidden in caves and tunnels. Taking the escarpment, which the Americans called Hacksaw Ridge, was essential to the advance on Okinawa, but every attempt to reach the top had ended in disaster. Soldiers climbed cargo nets and rope ladders to the summit, only to be cut down by machine gun fire and mortars. the Japanese defenders had perfect fields of fire and hundreds of hidden positions. Bodies piled up at the base of the cliff. The 77th Division was ordered to take Hacksaw Ridge, no matter the cost. On May 4th, 1945, Desmond Doss climbed the cargo nets with the rest of his company and reached the top of Hacksaw Ridge just after dawn. The view from the top was surreal. The plateau was scarred with shell craters and littered with debris. In the distance, Desmond could see the ruins of Shuri Castle, a Japanese stronghold. Closer, he could see the mouths of caves and tunnels where Japanese soldiers were hiding. The fighting started almost immediately. Japanese soldiers emerged from the tunnels, firing rifles and throwing grenades. Mortars rained down from positions the Americans could not see. Machine guns opened up from multiple directions. Within minutes, dozens of American soldiers were wounded or dead. Desmond went to work. He moved from man to man, bandaging wounds, injecting morphine, dragging soldiers to covered positions. He worked through the day without stopping. Explosions threw dirt and shrapnel into the air. Bullets snapped past his head. Desmond did not flinch. He prayed as he worked. "Please, Lord, keep me safe so I can help one more." The fighting on Hacksaw Ridge was the most intense Desmond had ever experienced. The Japanese defenders were relentless. They launched counterattacks throughout the day, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in waves. American soldiers fired until their rifles overheated. They threw grenades until they ran out. They fixed bayonets and fought hand to hand in the shell craters. Desmond stayed in the middle of it all, treating wounded men, ignoring the danger. At one point, a mortar shell landed 10 feet from him and exploded. The blast knocked him off his feet and left him dazed, but he was not seriously injured. He got up, shook his head, and kept working. By nightfall, the Americans had suffered horrific casualties, but they still held the top of the ridge. Captain Glover ordered his men to dig in and prepare for a counterattack. Everyone knew it was coming. At 10 p.m., the Japanese launched a massive assault. Hundreds of soldiers poured out of the caves and tunnels, screaming and firing. The Americans fought back, but they were overwhelmed. Flares lit up the night sky, casting eerie shadows across the battlefield. Men fought hand to hand in the darkness. The Japanese pushed the Americans back toward the edge of the cliff. American soldiers were killed in their foxholes. Others were bayoneted as they tried to retreat. The situation was desperate. At midnight, Captain Glover made the decision to retreat. He ordered all remaining soldiers to climb down the cargo nets and regroup at the base of the ridge. They would try again in the morning. The order went out, and one by one, the Americans withdrew. Desmond heard the order. He saw his fellow soldiers climbing down the nets, disappearing into the darkness. But when he looked around, he saw wounded men lying in foxholes, bleeding, unconscious, dying. He could not leave them. He decided to stay. Desmond Doss did not retreat. He stayed on top of Hacksaw Ridge, alone, surrounded by Japanese soldiers with no weapon and no backup. He moved through the darkness, searching for wounded Americans. Every few minutes, a flare would go up, and Desmond would freeze, hoping the Japanese would not see him. He could hear Japanese voices nearby, speaking in a language he did not understand. He could hear footsteps. He could hear the clinking of equipment. He stayed low and moved slowly. He found soldiers lying in foxholes, some conscious, some not. He bandaged them as best he could, then dragged them to the edge of the cliff. He had no way to carry them down, so he improvised. He found a rope, tied it around each man's chest, braced himself against a rock, and lowered the soldier down the 400-foot drop. It was back-breaking work. The rope cut into his hands. The weight of each man pulled him toward the edge, but he did not stop. At the bottom, other medics would untie the man and send the rope back up. Desmond pulled the rope up, whispered his prayer, and went back for another man. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." He did this 75 times. Some of the men he saved were conscious and begged him not to leave them. Others were unconscious and had no idea they were being rescued. Desmond did not care. He saved them all. He worked through the night under constant fire, with Japanese soldiers patrolling less than 50 yards away. Several times, Japanese soldiers spotted him and raised their rifles to shoot. According to Desmond and several witnesses who interviewed him after the war, their weapons jammed every single time. Desmond believed it was divine intervention. The soldiers who heard the story later believed it too. Desmond did not just save Americans. At one point, he found a wounded Japanese soldier lying in a shell crater. The man was bleeding out from a stomach wound. Desmond knelt beside him, bandaged the wound, and left him water. Then he moved on to the next American. He did not have time to treat enemy wounded, but he could not ignore a dying man. By dawn, Desmond had lowered 75 men down the cliff. His hands were raw and bleeding from the rope. His uniform was soaked in blood, some of it his, most of it not. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and nearly deaf from the explosions. But he kept going. At 6 a.m., as the sun rose over Hacksaw Ridge, a Japanese grenade landed near Desmond. He saw it, and without thinking, he threw himself on top of a wounded soldier to shield him from the blast. The grenade exploded, and Desmond was hit by 17 pieces of shrapnel. His legs and torso were torn apart. He collapsed, bleeding, unable to stand. Other American soldiers, who had begun climbing back up the ridge at dawn, finally reached him. They placed him on a stretcher and started carrying him toward the cliff edge. As they were moving him, Desmond saw another soldier lying wounded nearby. The man's injuries looked worse than his own. Desmond rolled off the stretcher and told the medics to take the other man first. He would wait. The medics argued with him, but Desmond refused to listen. They took the other man. Desmond waited. He waited for 5 hours. During that time, the fighting continued. Mortars exploded around him. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks. Desmond lay on the ground, bleeding, unable to move. At one point, a Japanese sniper saw him and fired. The bullet hit Desmond in the left arm, shattering the bone. Desmond screamed in pain, but there was no one nearby to help. He looked around and found a rifle stock lying on the ground. He used it as a splint, tying it in place with strips of cloth torn from his uniform. He tied it with one hand and his teeth. Then he waited some more. At 11 a.m., medics finally reached him again. They put him on a stretcher and carried him down the cliff. He had been on top of Hacksaw Ridge for more than 12 hours, most of it alone, and he had saved 75 men. Desmond spent the next several weeks in a field hospital on Okinawa, then was evacuated to a hospital ship. Doctors removed the shrapnel from his body piece by piece. They saved his left arm, though the bone was so badly shattered that he never regained full use of it. While he was recovering, letters began arriving from the men he had saved. They thanked him. They told him he was a hero. They apologized for the way they had treated him in training. One letter came from Captain Jack Glover, the officer who had tried to have Desmond court-martialed. The letter said, "Private Doss, you are the bravest man I have ever met. I was wrong about you. I apologize for everything I did. I am proud to have served with you." Desmond folded the letter and kept it for the rest of his life. On October 12, 1945, Desmond Doss stood in the East Room of the White House in Washington, D.C. His left arm was in a sling. His uniform hung loose on his frame because he had lost so much weight. President Harry Truman stood in front of him, holding a medal. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Desmond's neck and shook his hand. Desmond was the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military award. The citation, read aloud by an Army officer, described what Desmond had done on Hacksaw Ridge. It said, he was a company aid man when the first platoon attacked a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. As our troops gained the summit, a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties and driving the others back. Private First Class Doss refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the many stricken, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment and there lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of a cliff to friendly hands. On May 21st, he uncomplainingly treated casualties until he himself was seriously wounded. His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry far above and beyond the call of duty. Desmond returned home to Virginia a hero, but the war had taken a terrible toll on his body. While recovering in the hospital, he contracted tuberculosis, a deadly lung infection. The disease destroyed his left lung, and doctors had to remove it entirely. Desmond spent the next 5.5 years in and out of veterans' hospitals, undergoing 8 surgeries. The antibiotics used to treat his tuberculosis caused him to lose most of his hearing. He was declared 90% disabled by the Veterans Administration. His fiancée, Dorothy Schutte, had waited for him throughout the war. They married in 1942, before he deployed, and she stood by him through all of his medical struggles. They were married for 46 years until Dorothy died of cancer in 1991. Desmond remarried a few years later to a woman named Frances Duman, who cared for him until his death. Desmond never boasted about what he did on Hacksaw Ridge. He rarely spoke about the war. He lived quietly on a small farm in Rising Fawn, Georgia, where he grew vegetables, raised chickens, and tended a small orchard. He attended church every Saturday and read his Bible every day. When people asked him how he saved 75 men, he would say, "I did not save them. God saved them. I just helped." He refused to accept praise. He refused to be interviewed by journalists. He did not want to be famous. He wanted to live a quiet life and serve God. But the men he saved never forgot him, and slowly, over the years, his story spread. In 1999, the Department of Veterans Affairs dedicated a new medical center in his honor. In 2004, the French government awarded him the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor for his service during World War II. In 2006, just months before his death, Desmond was invited to the Pentagon to meet with senior military officials who wanted to honor him. He was too weak to travel, so they came to him. In 2016, 10 years after his death, director Mel Gibson released a film about his life called Hacksaw Ridge. The film starred Andrew Garfield as Desmond and was nominated for 6 Academy Awards. It introduced Desmond's story to a new generation and reminded the world that heroism does not require a weapon. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He was buried at Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee with full military honors. His Medal of Honor is on display at the National Museum of the United States Army in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. His widow, Frances, said after his death, "Desmond did what he thought was right, and he never looked back. He never regretted his decision. He believed that God protected him, and he was grateful for every day he had." The men who served with Desmond Doss never forgot him. One soldier, a man named Clarence Glenn, who fought on Hacksaw Ridge and was saved by Desmond, said years later in an interview, "I saw the bravest man I have ever known that day. He had no weapon, but he was more dangerous to the enemy than anyone with a rifle because he kept us alive. He kept us fighting. Without him, we would have lost that ridge." Another soldier, Ralph Baker, said, "Desmond Doss saved my life. I hated him in training. I thought he was a coward. I thought he was going to get us all killed. I was wrong. He was the strongest man I ever met, and I owe him everything." Captain Jack Glover, the officer who tried to have Desmond court-martialed and force him out of the Army, said in an interview decades later, "I wanted him gone. I thought he would be a liability. I thought he would get men killed. Instead, he saved more men than any soldier I ever commanded. I was wrong about him, and I spent the rest of my life grateful that I was wrong." Desmond Doss went to war without a weapon. He faced hatred, violence, and death. He was beaten, ridiculed, and nearly destroyed by the very institution he wanted to serve. But he never wavered. He saved 75 men in one night, and he did it by staying true to a promise he made when he was 7 years old. He never fired a shot. He never took a life. and he became one of the greatest heroes in the history of the United States military. His story is a reminder that courage is not about killing. It is about conviction. It is about standing alone when everyone else runs. It is about looking at a dying man and saying, "I will not leave you." Desmond Doss proved that you do not need a weapon to be a warrior. You just need a reason worth dying for and the faith to see it through.